Right now, somewhere in the Amazon, a person who has never seen a gym, never counted a calorie, and never taken a supplement in their life has better cardiovascular health than the average resident of any major American city. Their arteries show almost no plaque buildup. Their blood pressure does not rise with age. Their resting heart rate would impress a professional athlete. Researchers found this by accident, and when they tried to explain it, the explanation forced a complete reconsideration of what a human diet is actually supposed to look like. In 2017, a team of researchers led by cardiologist Hillard Kaplan published findings in the medical journal The Lancet that startled the cardiology community. They had spent years studying the Tsimané people of the Bolivian Amazon, a population whose diet and lifestyle had remained largely unchanged for generations, and the cardiovascular health data they collected was, by Western medical standards, almost unbelievable. Among the Tsimané studied, 85% showed no evidence of coronary artery plaque whatsoever. Not low risk, none. Across all age groups studied, including elderly participants in their 70s and 80s, the prevalence of atherosclerosis, the arterial plaque buildup responsible for the majority of heart attacks and strokes in industrialized nations, was the lowest ever recorded in any population studied by modern medicine. The researchers did not initially believe their own data. The imaging was repeated. The methodology was reviewed. The result held. What makes this finding significant is not simply that an isolated population has healthy hearts. It is what their diet reveals about what the human body actually evolved to process, and what it suggests about the diet that most of the industrialized world now consumes without question. The Tsimané diet is not exotic by the standards of Amazon tribes generally. It is, in fact, fairly representative of what anthropologists and nutritional researchers have documented across multiple Amazonian communities for decades. The foundation of the diet is plantain and manioc, starchy staples providing the majority of daily caloric intake, prepared in ways that preserve their fiber content rather than stripping it through industrial processing. Protein comes from fish, caught fresh from river systems, and from wild game including peccary, tapir, and a range of smaller mammals and birds. Meat that, unlike industrially farmed livestock, comes from animals that moved constantly, ate a varied wild diet, and carried almost none of the saturated fat marbling that characterizes commercially produced meat in the developed world. Researchers analyzing the fat content of wild game consumed by Amazon tribes have consistently found a dramatically different fatty acid profile than farmed meat, significantly higher in omega-3 fatty acids, lower in the saturated fats associated with cardiovascular disease, and containing almost none of the trans fats that do not naturally occur in any traditional diet but are now present throughout the processed food supply of industrialized nations. The Tsimané consume, by Kaplan's research team's calculations, between 14 and 17% of their daily calories from fat, compared to an average of approximately 34% in the typical American diet. Their fiber intake, driven by the unprocessed plant foods that form the bulk of their meals, exceeds typical American consumption by a margin that researchers described as almost incomparable using standard dietary assessment frameworks calibrated for industrialized populations. What this means in practical terms is that the cardiovascular system most resistant to disease in any population yet studied belongs to people whose diet looks almost nothing like what nutritional science, until recently, considered optimal. The question that follows naturally from the Tsimané data is what would actually happen physiologically if someone accustomed to a typical industrialized diet adopted an Amazon tribal eating pattern. Not permanently, just long enough for the body to begin showing measurable change. The honest answer requires separating what is well documented from what remains reasonably inferred but not directly tested in controlled clinical trials. Because no rigorous study has placed industrialized participants on a full Amazon tribal diet for exactly 30 days under laboratory monitoring. What can be reconstructed with reasonable confidence comes from combining what is known about the specific dietary components involved with documented physiological responses to similar interventions that have been studied directly. The first systemic change would likely begin within the first several days, driven primarily by the dramatic shift in fiber intake. The Tsimané diet's fiber content, sourced from unprocessed plantain, manioc, and a range of wild fruits and vegetables, would represent for most industrialized eaters an increase of 2 to 3 times their typical daily intake. Research on high-fiber dietary interventions consistently documents measurable changes in gut microbiome composition within 72 hours of significant fiber increase, with the diversity and population of beneficial bacterial species, particularly those associated with the production of short-chain fatty acids linked to reduced inflammation, showing significant growth within the first week. This is not a minor metabolic footnote. The gut microbiome has been increasingly understood through research conducted over the past 15 years to play a direct role in immune function, inflammatory regulation, and even neurological signaling through what researchers now describe as the gut-brain axis. A 2014 study published in Nature found that dietary shifts toward higher fiber and reduced processed food intake produced measurable changes in gut bacterial composition within just days. Changes associated, in subsequent research, with reduced markers of systemic inflammation. By the second week, the dramatic reduction in processed sugar and refined carbohydrate intake inherent to an Amazon tribal diet would likely begin producing measurable changes in blood glucose regulation. The Tsimané diet contains essentially no refined sugar and minimal refined carbohydrate of any kind, a stark contrast to the average industrialized diet, in which added sugar accounts for a substantial portion of daily caloric intake. Research on dietary interventions removing refined sugar and processed carbohydrates consistently documents improved insulin sensitivity within 1 to 2 weeks, along with more stable blood glucose levels throughout the day, and a documented reduction in the glucose spikes and subsequent crashes associated with high glycemic processed food consumption. The shift in fat composition, moving from the saturated and trans fat-heavy profile of typical industrialized diets toward the omega-3 rich profile of wild game and fish that characterizes Amazon tribal eating, would begin producing measurable changes in blood lipid markers within the same general time frame. Research on omega-3 supplementation and dietary shifts toward wild-caught fish and game consistently documents reductions in triglyceride levels and improvements in the ratio of beneficial to harmful cholesterol markers within 2 to 4 weeks of sustained dietary change. By the third week, the physiological changes would likely extend beyond blood work into something more immediately noticeable: energy regulation and physical performance. The Tsimané and Amazon tribes generally do not experience the energy fluctuations that characterize the typical industrialized eating pattern: the mid-morning crash, the post-lunch fatigue, the late afternoon need for caffeine or sugar to push through the remainder of the day. This is not because their lives are less physically demanding. Tsimané daily activity levels, measured through accelerometer studies conducted as part of Kaplan's research, showed physical activity levels several times higher than the average American adult, sustained across the entire lifespan, including into old age. What appears to drive the difference in energy stability is the combination of stable blood glucose, driven by the low glycemic, high-fiber nature of the diet, and a caloric intake pattern built around whole foods that require more digestive processing and release energy more gradually than the rapidly absorbed simple carbohydrates and processed foods that dominate the industrialized diet. Research on glycemic stability and energy perception consistently finds that diets producing fewer blood glucose spikes correlate with more stable subjective energy levels and reduced reported fatigue throughout the day. A person adopting this dietary pattern for 30 days would likely experience, by the third week, a noticeable reduction in energy fluctuation throughout the day. Though the adjustment period itself, particularly during the first several days, often involves a temporary period of fatigue and even mild withdrawal-like symptoms as the body adjusts to the absence of the rapid glucose spikes that processed sugar and refined carbohydrates provide. Researchers studying dietary transitions away from high sugar, high processed food patterns have documented this adjustment period consistently, typically resolving within 5 to 10 days as metabolic patterns stabilize around the new dietary input. Inflammatory markers represent another area where measurable change would likely occur within the 30-day window. The Tsimané, studied by Kaplan's team, showed inflammatory marker levels, specifically C-reactive protein, a standard clinical marker of systemic inflammation, that were significantly lower than age-matched industrialized populations, even accounting for their substantially higher rates of parasitic infection, which would typically be expected to elevate inflammatory markers rather than suppress them. This finding particularly puzzled the research team, suggesting that the anti-inflammatory properties of the Tsimané diet were powerful enough to counteract a baseline inflammatory burden that industrialized populations do not carry. Research on dietary interventions emphasizing whole foods, reduced processed food intake, and increased omega-3 consumption has documented measurable reductions in C-reactive protein and other inflammatory markers within timeframes ranging from 2 to 6 weeks, depending on the magnitude of dietary change and individual physiological variation. A 30-day adoption of an Amazon tribal eating pattern would fall within the window where measurable anti-inflammatory effects would reasonably be expected to begin appearing in bloodwork. What the research on the Tsimané and similar Amazon tribal populations reveals, when examined honestly, is not a simple story of primitive diets being superior to modern ones. It is more specific and more useful than that. The human metabolic system evolved over a span of time, during which the foods available were, almost without exception, unprocessed, fiber-rich, low in refined sugar, and sourced from wild plants and animals with fat and nutrient profiles substantially different from their industrially farmed modern equivalents. The Tsimané, the Yanomami, and other Amazon tribal populations have not discovered some secret nutritional technology. They have simply continued eating, largely unchanged across generations, the category of diet that human metabolic systems were already adapted to process efficiently. While the industrialized world transitioned within the span of a single century to a dramatically different dietary pattern that the human body has not had evolutionary time to adapt to. This distinction matters because it changes what the Tsimané data actually implies. It is not evidence that modern food is poison or that only a return to primitive subsistence can produce health. It is evidence that specific, identifiable components of the industrialized diet, refined sugar, trans fats, ultra-processed carbohydrates, the near-total absence of dietary fiber relative to caloric intake, are doing measurable documented harm, and that removing or reducing them, even temporarily, produces physiological benefits that begin appearing within weeks rather than years. Kaplan's research team, in subsequent publications building on their initial findings, were explicit about this distinction. The Tsimané result was not presented as proof that civilization causes heart disease. It was presented as evidence that the specific dietary and activity patterns common throughout most of human evolutionary history remain protective against cardiovascular disease when maintained, and that the rapid divergence from those patterns over the past century corresponds closely with the rapid rise in cardiovascular and metabolic disease that now represents the leading cause of death across the industrialized world. A 30-day adoption of an Amazon tribal dietary pattern would not replicate the cardiovascular outcomes that Tsimané demonstrate, which are the product of a lifetime, in many cases multiple generations, of sustained dietary and activity patterns combined with genetic and environmental factors that cannot be isolated or replicated through a short-term intervention. What 30 days would very likely produce, based on the documented research on the individual components of this dietary shift, is measurable improvement across several specific biomarkers. Reduced inflammatory markers, improved blood glucose regulation, more favorable blood lipid profiles, measurable changes in gut microbiome composition, and a noticeable stabilization of daily energy levels. These are not small effects. They are, by the standards of modern preventive cardiology, significant changes achieved through dietary modification alone, without medication, within a time frame most people would consider remarkably short. The Tsimané did not set out to prove anything to modern medicine. They have simply continued eating the way their ancestors ate, in an environment that provided exactly what the human body, across the long arc of its evolutionary history, was built to use. What 30 days inside that pattern would do to anyone willing to try it is not speculation anymore. It is, increasingly, documented science, arriving decades after the people who never needed to discover it were already living the answer.